The cell smelled like oxidized copper and 3 weeks of my own unwashed sweat. When the guards finally dragged me out, I expected the firing squad. Instead, I got an audience with the Queen. She didn't want my head on a pike. She wanted my DNA in her royal lineage. Marry her widowed, grieving daughter, or rot in the mines. It wasn't a choice. It was a hostage negotiation where I was both the currency and the captive. The stone floor was slick with condensation. It seeped through the thin fabric of my trousers, chilling the bruised flesh of my knees. I had been sitting in the same corner for what felt like 4 days, tracing the irregular mortar joints with a split thumbnail. There was no natural light, just the sickly amber glow of a lumen strip recessed into the ceiling. It hummed. A low, vibrating drone that nested behind my eyes and bred migraines. When the heavy iron door finally scraped open, the sound was deafening. I didn't look up immediately. I just stopped tracing the mortar. 2 guards stepped in. They were tall. Too tall, their proportions stretched just enough to trigger the uncanny valley response that had kept humanity on edge since first contact. Their armor wasn't the sleek, polished silver of holovids. It was matte black, scratched and dented, smelling of gun oil and old leather. "Up," the one on the left said. His voice was guttural, pushed through a vocal tract that wasn't designed for standard English. I didn't argue. Defiance is a luxury for men who have had a hot meal and more than 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I pushed myself up, my joints popping like dry twigs. A sharp, localized pain flared in my left shoulder, a souvenir from the butt of a rifle during my capture. I swayed, catching myself on the damp wall. They didn't grab me. They didn't need to. They just fell into step beside me as I limped out of the cell and into the corridor. The air outside the holding block was different. The stagnant, coppery stench of the dungeon gave way to something sharp and floral, like crushed pine needles masking the smell of antiseptic. We walked. My boots, stripped of their laces, flopped awkwardly against the polished obsidian floor. I focused on the sound. Slap, drag, slap, drag. My mind wasn't racing with escape plans. It was too tired for that. I was just cataloging the route. 5 left turns, 2 right. Up a spiraling staircase where the air grew warmer, thinner. My lungs burned. The gravity here was a fraction heavier than Earth standard, just enough to make every step feel like walking through waist-deep water. We passed windows, slits, really, carved into the thick stone. Through them, I caught glimpses of an alien sky, a bruised, turbulent purple bleeding into bruised orange. The city below was a sprawling mess of brutalist concrete and organic, twisting metal spires. It looked hostile. It felt hostile. The guard stopped in front of a pair of doors made from some pale, porous wood. The grain looked like twisting, agonized faces if you stared at it long enough. I looked away. "Stand straight," the guard on the right muttered. I wiped a smear of dried blood from my split lip with the back of a filthy hand. "This is as straight as it gets, buddy," he grunted, pushing the doors open. The light inside was blinding. Not the amber of the cells, but a stark clinical white that poured from high arched windows. My pupils, dilated from weeks in the dark, screamed. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears leaking down my grime-caked cheeks. "Step forward, human." The voice was not loud, but it carried. It was smooth, sanded down by years of giving orders that were never questioned. It was the kind of voice that ordered orbital strikes between sips of tea. I forced my eyes open, squinting through the blur. The room wasn't a grand throne room. It was a study. Shelves of bound paper, an absurd luxury, lined the walls. In the center sat a massive desk, carved from the same pale wood as the doors. Behind it sat Queen Vivian. She looked entirely too human, and yet completely alien. Her skin was the color of old ivory, her hair a startling absolute white, pulled back in tight, severe braids. She wasn't wearing a crown. She wore a tailored military tunic, charcoal gray, unadorned except for a single silver clasp at the collar. I stood there, swaying slightly, smelling my own stench in this pristine room. I waited for the sentence. Death by firing squad. Death by vacuum. Death by public execution to appease the masses. Instead, she steepled her long, multi-jointed fingers and looked at me as if I were a slightly defective piece of machinery. "You look terrible, Mr. Cole," she said. "Your hospitality leaves something to be desired, Your Majesty," I croaked. My throat felt like it was coated in sand. Vivienne didn't smile, but a muscle near her eye twitched. "Sit." She gestured to a chair opposite her desk. It was a spindly thing, metal and black leather. I collapsed into it, barely catching my own weight. The leather was cold against my back through the tears in my shirt. She poured a clear liquid from a glass carafe into a small, fragile cup and slid it across the desk. I stared at it. "It's water, Cole. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be sitting in my private study." I picked it up. My hand was shaking. I hated that she could see it. I brought it to my lips and drank. It was freezing, tasting faintly of minerals and ozone. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I drained it and set the cup down. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice a fraction steadier. Vivian leaned back. "Your squad is dead. Your dropship is scrap metal in the southern marshlands. Your government has officially disavowed your little reconnaissance mission, which means you are technically a stateless combatant. Under the Accords, I could have you executed with no diplomatic blowback. So do it," I said. The words came out flat. I wasn't being brave. I was just exhausted. The constant adrenaline of the past 3 weeks had crashed, leaving nothing but a hollow void in my chest. "Waste is a sin," she replied smoothly, "and you, Cole, possess a very specific, very rare value." I laughed, a dry, barking sound that tore at my cracked ribs. "I'm a mercenary, a trigger puller. The only value I have is pointing a gun and taking a check." "You are human," she corrected. "And humanity has spent the last decade carving a bloody, terrifying reputation across this sector. You are known for being relentless, stubborn, impossible to eradicate." She stood up, walking to the window. The stark light washed over her features, highlighting the deep lines of stress around her mouth. "My husband died 3 cycles ago," she said, not looking at me. "My military is fractured. The northern barons are testing my borders. They view my reign as weak. They view my family as vulnerable." "Sounds like a local problem," I muttered, pressing a hand to my throbbing shoulder. She turned, her eyes locking onto mine. They were a pale, icy blue. "It is a problem I am solving today. My daughter Rowena lost her husband in the last skirmish with the barons. She is a widow, childless, and a prime target for a political marriage to one of my enemies to force a truce." I stopped rubbing my shoulder. The pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they formed was absurd. No. Yes. You want to marry your daughter off to a human? I stared at her, genuinely baffled. I haven't showered in 3 weeks. I don't know which fork to use at a banquet. I'm a grunt. You are a symbol, Vivian said, her voice hardening. If my daughter marries one of the barons, I lose the North. If she marries a human, it sends a message. It says I have the backing of the most volatile, violent species in the quadrant. It says my bloodline is merging with apex predators. The barons fear humanity more than they fear me. A human in the royal house will make them hesitate. Hesitation is all I need to consolidate my forces. I let out a long breath, staring at the polished grain of the desk. The sheer, cold pragmatism of it was staggering. And if I say no? There are cobalt mines in the eastern ranges, she said casually. The life expectancy of a worker there is roughly 4 months. Your lungs will crystallize, and you will drown in your own blood. It is a slow, deeply unpleasant way to die. I sat in silence. The hum of the building's ventilation system seemed incredibly loud. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused, scarred, coated in grime. These hands had built nothing. They had only ever taken things apart. Now they were being asked to hold up a dying monarchy. She must hate the idea, I said quietly. Rowena despises it, Vivian agreed. She despises you. She is grieving a husband she loved deeply, but she understands duty. The question is, do you understand survival? I didn't want to be a prince. I didn't want to be a symbol. But I closed my eyes and pictured the cobalt mines. I felt the cold damp of the cell on my knees. I wanted to live. It was a base, ugly, undeniable instinct. I opened my eyes. Do I get a shower first? They scrubbed me raw. 2 silent attendants led me to a washroom, composed entirely of gray slate and scalding water. They didn't speak, just handed me a block of harsh, unscented soap and a stiff brush. I stood under the spray until the water ran clear, watching the dirt and dried blood spiral down the brass drain. They left clothes for me. Not armor, not royal finery, but a simple, heavy linen shirt and dark trousers. They fit surprisingly well. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The grime was gone, but the hollows under my eyes remained, purple and deep. My hair, damp and overgrown, curled awkwardly around my ears. I looked like a ghost dressed for a funeral. A new guard, wearing ceremonial silver instead of combat black, escorted me. We walked through wider corridors now, past tapestries that depicted violent, bloody battles woven in muted threads. The air smelled of beeswax and old dust. We stopped at a heavy oak door. The guard knocked twice, then pushed it open, gesturing for me to enter. I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind me, the sound final, like a vault locking. The room was vast, but claustrophobic. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the windows, blocking out the sun. The only light came from dozens of thick, white candles burning in wrought iron stands. The air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh and ozone. She was standing by the fireplace, her back to me. Rowena. She wore black, not a dress, but a high-collared morning coat that swept the floor, severe and unyielding. Her hair, the same startling white as her mother's, was loose, cascading down her back like a waterfall of ice. She didn't turn around. They say humans smell like wet ash and copper, she said. Her voice was softer than the Queen's, but it held a jagged edge. A voice that had been screaming and had finally run out of breath. I stood near the door, keeping my distance. Right now, I mostly smell like your mother's lye soap. She turned. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her late 20s. Her face was striking, pale and sharp, but her eyes were ruined. They were red-rimmed, exhausted, burning with a grief so intense it felt radioactive. I could see the tremor in her jaw as she looked at me, taking in the bruised human her mother had bought for her. "You look weak," she stated, her gaze dragging over my frame. "I've been in a dungeon for a month," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'm not exactly at peak performance." She took a step toward me. The heavy fabric of her coat rustled against the stone floor. "My husband Thomas was twice your size. He was a warrior, a commander. He died holding the line at the Winter Pass." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. I meant it, but it sounded hollow in the vast, shadowed room. "Don't," she snapped, the word cracking like a whip. "Do not patronize me with human platitudes. You don't care about Thomas. You don't care about our kingdom. You are a mercenary who took a coward's bargain to save his own skin." I felt a flare of anger, hot and sudden, burning through the exhaustion. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. She didn't flinch, though she had to tilt her head up to hold my gaze. "You're right," I said, my voice dropping. "I don't care about your kingdom. I don't care about your barons. And I didn't ask to be dragged out of a cell and forced into this." I pointed a finger at her, my hand shaking slightly. "You think I want this? You think I want to play dress-up in a castle while my crew rots in a swamp? I was given a choice between marrying a stranger who hates me or coughing up my lungs in a cobalt mine. I chose to breathe. Don't act like I orchestrated this." Rowena stared at me. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. For a second, I thought she was going to strike me. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles turning white. Instead, a harsh, bitter laugh tore from her throat. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a spring snapping under pressure. "We are both prisoners then," she whispered, looking away from me, staring into the flickering flames of the hearth. "Yeah," I said, rubbing the back of my neck, the anger draining out of me just as quickly as it had arrived. "Looks like it." She walked over to a small table near the fire. There were 2 heavy crystal glasses and a decanter filled with an amber liquid. She poured 2 measures, her hands remarkably steady despite the tremor in her voice moments ago. She picked up one glass and turned to me, holding it out. "My mother believes your presence will terrify the North," Rowena said, her eyes meeting mine again. The blinding hatred had dialed back, replaced by a cold, calculating grief. I walked over and took the glass. Our fingers brushed. Her skin was freezing. "I don't know much about politics," I admitted, swirling the heavy liquor in the glass. It smelled like peat smoke and burnt sugar. "But I know how to survive, and I know how to make people back off." She raised her glass, the firelight catching the crystal. "To survival, then," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "Husband." I touched my glass to hers. The clink was sharp in the quiet room. "To survival," I echoed, and took a drink. It burned on the way down, leaving a bitter aftertaste that I knew was going to linger for a very long time. The ceremonial uniform they shoved me into weighed roughly 30 pounds. It was a suffocating layer cake of thick charcoal wool, reinforced leather, and a stiff, silver-threaded high collar that chewed into the underside of my jaw every time I swallowed. The boots were polished to a mirror shine, but they were too narrow at the toe. Every step sent a dull spike of pain up my calves. I stood in the antechamber behind the great hall, pulling at the cuffs. My knuckles were still scabbed. The contrast between the pristine fabric and my ruined hands felt like a bad joke. "Stop fidgeting." Rowena didn't look at me. She stood beside the heavy double doors, staring straight ahead. She was wearing white, a blinding heavy silk that draped over her like a shroud rather than a gown. Her hair was pinned up in a complex, agonizingly tight lattice of silver wire. If she was breathing, I couldn't tell. She looked like a statue carved from salt. "I'm losing circulation in my feet," I muttered, shifting my weight. "And this collar is trying to decapitate me." "It is traditional," she said, her voice entirely flat. "The high collar signifies vigilance. The heavy wool signifies the burden of the state. And the tight boots? Probably to keep you from running," she replied. I looked at her. It was the first time she had said anything remotely resembling a joke, though her delivery was as dry as a bone. I let out a short exhale through my nose. Fair enough. A low, resonant gong echoed from the other side of the doors. It vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up through my pinching boots and settling in my teeth. The murmur of the crowd beyond died instantly. "Showtime," I whispered. "Do not embarrass me," Rowena said. Her voice trembled. Just a fraction. It was the first crack in the ice since I'd walked into her morning room yesterday. She wasn't just grieving, she was terrified. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She was throwing herself to the wolves, and I was the leash she was forced to hold. "I won't," I said. I didn't offer a comforting smile. I didn't reach for her hand. That kind of fake intimacy would have insulted her. Instead, I squared my shoulders, ignoring the phantom pain from the rifle butt injury, and stared straight at the seam of the doors. The heavy wood swung outward. The great hall smelled of burning wax, expensive perfumes, and underlying panic. The light was harsh, bouncing off the polished obsidian pillars. Hundreds of faces turned toward us. They were nobles, military commanders, diplomats. They were tall, pale, and rigid, and they all looked at me with a mixture of revulsion and deep, primal unease. We walked. Slap, drag had become click, clack with the ceremonial boots. I kept my eyes forward, but my peripheral vision was working overtime. I cataloged the room, 3 exits, high windows, inaccessible. Guards stationed every 10 paces, carrying kinetic rifles. The crowd was parted by a long aisle running directly toward a raised dais where Queen Vivian stood. As we passed the halfway mark, the crowd pressed in slightly. The hostility was a physical pressure in the air. On my left, a man stepped half a pace out of the line, narrowing the aisle. He was massive, built like a brick wall in a crimson military coat, heavily laden with medals. His skin was scarred, and his eyes were a sickly, jaundiced yellow. A northern baron, or one of their top dogs. He didn't move back as we approached. He was forcing us to either stop or brush against him. A petty, calculated dominance display. Rowena stiffened beside me, her step faltering slightly. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just turned my head and looked directly into his jaundiced eyes. I didn't glare. Glaring is what you do when you want someone to know you're tough. Instead, I just looked at him the way a butcher looks at a side of beef. Cold, calculating. I let my lips pull back just a fraction, exposing my teeth in what humans call a smile. but what every other species in the galaxy recognizes as a bared fang threat display. The air between us seemed to freeze. For a split second, the Baron's bravado held. Then, an ancient, reptilian part of his brain recognized the look in my eyes. It was the look of a species that had bombed its own home planet to ash just to win a war. It was the look of a scavenger that didn't care how big you were, only how much effort it would take to bleed you out. The Baron took a half step back. His heel clicked against the stone. I broke eye contact, returning my gaze to the Queen on the dais, and kept walking. Beside me, I heard Rowena let out a sharp, barely audible breath. We reached the steps. Queen Vivian held a heavy ledger bound in dark leather. There was no priest. There was no music. "You stand before the court of the sovereign," Vivian's voice cut through the silence. It didn't need amplification. It was a blade in the quiet room. "To bind the blood of the ruling house with the blood of earth." She looked at Rowena. "Do you, Rowena of House Kalen, accept this bond for the security of the realm?" Rowena's jaw clenched. She stared at the ledger. "I do." Vivian turned her pale, icy eyes to me. "Do you, Coal of Earth, accept this bond, pledging your life, your violence, and your loyalty to this house?" "My violence." I liked that she didn't dress it up in noble terms. She knew exactly what she was buying. "I do," I said. My voice was raspy, carrying through the hall. Vivienne offered a quill to Rowena. She signed her name with sharp, jagged strokes. She handed the quill to me. I took it, my bruised fingers gripping the feathered shaft awkwardly. I scratched my name onto the thick, fibrous paper. The ink was a dark, rusted red. "It is witnessed," Vivian declared, slamming the ledger shut. The sound was like a gunshot. "The alliance is sealed." There was no applause, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked out over the crowd. The nobles stared back. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Certainty. They knew blood was going to spill. It was just a matter of whose and when. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us inside the royal apartments. The quiet was immediate, pressing against my eardrums after the low-frequency hum of the great hall's crowd. Rowena walked straight to the center of the room and stopped. She didn't take off the heavy white coat. She just stood there, her back to me, her shoulders rigid. The tension radiating off her could have powered a small city. I took a slow breath, letting the smell of the room wash over me. Dust, wood polish, a faint trace of dried lavender, and under it all, the metallic tang of old, uncirculated air. It felt more like a museum exhibit than a bedroom. I ignored the massive four-poster bed dominating the far wall. Instead, I walked the perimeter. I unbuttoned the top two clasps of the tortuous high collar, finally pulling a full breath into my lungs. "What are you doing?" Rowena's voice was sharp. "Checking the sight lines," I said, casually, pausing by a tall, narrow window. I pulled the heavy velvet drape back an inch. We were high up, 4th floor, maybe 5th, a sheer drop down to a paved courtyard. No balconies, no obvious handholds on the outer stone. "Who has access to this room?" She turned to face me, her brow furrowed. "What? Keys, codes. Who cleans it? Who lights the fire?" I pointed to the hearth, where a low peat fire smoldered, throwing off a weak orange glow. "Because if your barons are as pissed off as they looked down there, setting us up in a shared suite is just asking for a midnight throat slitting." Rowena stared at me, her expression shifting from irritation to a cold, flat stare. You think they would assassinate us on our wedding night? I think if I wanted to destabilize a kingdom, taking out the grieving princess and her new, terrifying human attack dog in one swipe would be a pretty solid opening move, I replied. I moved away from the window and checked the hinges on the adjoining bathroom door. Solid brass. Good. They wouldn't dare, she said, though the conviction in her voice was brittle. My mother has the royal guard stationed at both ends of the corridor. I laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. Right, because guards never take bribes. Look, princess, do not call me that. The venom in her voice was sudden and absolute. My name is Rowena. If you must speak to me, use it. I stopped checking the doorframe and looked at her. Her hands were curled into tight fists. Her eyes were burning with that same radioactive grief I'd seen the day before. Okay. Rowena, I said, keeping my tone entirely neutral. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to keep us breathing until sunrise. You know politics. I know killing. Let me do my job. I walked over to the massive wardrobe and opened it. Empty. I pulled one of the heavy wooden shelves completely out of its tracks. It was thick oak, about 3 feet long. What are you doing with that? She demanded. I walked over to the main door and jammed the wooden shelf under the heavy iron handle, wedging the other end against a dip in the stone floor. I kicked it hard, locking it into place. Improvised deadbolt, I muttered, testing the door. It didn't budge. Now, even if they have a key, they have to break the door down. The noise gives us about 10 seconds to react. I turned back to her. She was watching me with a strange expression. It wasn't hatred anymore. It was something closer to morbid fascination, like watching a bizarre insect build a nest. You live like this? She asked quietly, constantly expecting the knife? I'm a mercenary, I said, sitting down on the edge of a stiff leather armchair. I started unlacing the agonizing boots. Paranoia is a job requirement. On Earth, we call it situational awareness. I finally pried the left boot off. I groaned, rubbing the abused joints of my foot. The relief was intoxicating. Rowena slowly reached up and began pulling the silver pins out of her hair. She dropped them, one by one, onto a side table. They made a sharp, rhythmic tink, tink, tink sound in the quiet room. Her white hair tumbled down over her shoulders, losing its severe structure. She looked exhausted. The adrenaline of the ceremony was fading, leaving her hollowed out. Thomas wasn't paranoid, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the flickering fire. He was brave. He believed in fighting face to face. He said traps and locked doors were for cowards. I pulled the right boot off and tossed it aside. Thomas sounds like a hell of a warrior. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing suspiciously, looking for the mockery. He was, and he died holding a mountain pass against overwhelming odds, right? I asked, leaning back in the chair. He took 50 of the Baron's men with him, she said, fiercely, her chin lifting. Which is a great story, I said softly. But he's still dead, and you're still a widow, and your mother is still terrified of losing her throne. Rowena flinched as if I had slapped her. How dare you? I dare because it's the truth, I interrupted, my voice hardening. Bravery is great for songs, but bravery gets you killed. Paranoia? Paranoia gets you old. I stood up, walking toward the fireplace. I didn't get too close to her. I didn't want to crowd her. I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to charge an army with a sword. I'm going to lock the doors, check the corners, and shoot whoever tries to come through the window. I survive. That's what humans do. We survive when we have no right to. She stared at me. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. For a moment, I thought she was going to scream for the guards. I thought she was going to have me thrown back in the cell. Instead, she let out a long, shaky breath. She reached up and unfastened the top clasp of her heavy morning coat. "There are extra blankets in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "The floor near the hearth is the least drafty." "Got it," I said. She turned and walked into the adjoining washroom, shutting the door behind her. The lock clicked. I stood alone in the center of the massive room. I looked at the wedged door, the heavy velvet curtains, and the smoldering fire. My ribs ached, my head pounded, and I was sleeping on a stone floor in an alien castle. But I wasn't in a cobalt mine. I walked over to the chest, pulled out a thick wool blanket that smelled strongly of mothballs, and tossed it onto the rug near the fire. I lay down, keeping my back to the wall, my eyes fixed on the door. It was going to be a long night. I woke to the smell of cold soot and my own stale breath. The fire had died somewhere around 300 hours, leaving the royal apartments hovering just above freezing. The stone floor had spent the night leaching every ounce of heat from my bones through the thin wool blanket. I rolled onto my back, my spine cracking in a jagged series of pops that sounded unnervingly loud in the silent room. Every muscle fiber I possessed felt like it had been soaked in battery acid and left out to dry. The rifle butt bruise on my shoulder throbbed with a slow, heavy pulse. I didn't get up immediately. I lay there on the hard floor, staring up at the vaulted ceiling hidden in the shadows, and listened. No footsteps in the corridor, no scraping of blades against leather. Just the low, distant hum of the castle's ventilation pushing recycled air through the massive stone lungs of the building. I pushed myself up, shivering in my linen shirt, and walked over to the door. The oak shelf I had wedged under the handle was still solidly in place. I kicked the base of it free. It clattered against the stone. "Is someone there?" Rowena's voice was thick with sleep, lacking the razor-sharp edge it had worn the day before. I turned. She was sitting up in the massive four-poster bed, clutching the heavy down comforter to her chest. Her white hair was a tangled, chaotic mess around her face, softening her severe features. For a second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, she didn't look like a grieving widow or a political pawn. She just looked tired. "Just taking down the barricade," I said, my voice rasping like dry leaves. "Sun's coming up." She blinked, the disorientation fading as reality reasserted itself. The softness vanished. Her jaw tightened, the mask of the stoic royal snapping back into place so fast it almost made an audible click. "You slept on the floor," she stated, as if observing a stray dog that had wandered into a sterile laboratory. It was that, or sleep with one eye open on a silk pillow, I replied. I walked over to the wash basin, grabbed the heavy ceramic pitcher, and poured freezing water over my face and neck. The shock of the cold was a brutal, necessary slap to the nervous system. "I prefer the floor. It keeps you honest." I dried my face with a rough towel that smelled faintly of dried lavender and stale dust. There was a sharp rap at the door. I dropped the towel, taking 2 steps toward the hearth to grab the heavy iron poker resting against the stone. "It's just the morning attendants," Rowena sighed, tossing the comforter aside. She stood up, wrapping a heavy silk robe around herself. Put that ridiculous thing down before you give a servant a heart attack. I didn't drop the poker, but I lowered it, stepping to the side of the door as I turned the handle. A young boy, barely a teenager, stood in the hallway holding a massive silver tray. His eyes darted to me, then to the iron bar in my hand. His skin went a sickly shade of chalk. He was trembling so hard the porcelain cups on the tray rattled together. "Bring it in," Rowena commanded. The boy scurried past me, set the tray on the low table near the window, and practically bolted back out the door. I shut it behind him, tossing the poker back onto the hearth. "You're terrifying the staff," Rowena said, pouring a steaming cup of something dark and viscous from the teapot. "Good," I said, pulling up a chair opposite her. "Terrified people gossip. I want the whole castle knowing I sleep with a weapon." I looked at the tray. The food was aggressively alien. There was a bowl of pale, gelatinous porridge that smelled faintly of sulfur and burnt sugar, alongside slices of a dark, cured meat that possessed a concerning iridescent sheen. "Your mother expects a show today," I said, picking up a silver spoon and poking the gray sludge. It jiggled defensively. Rowena took a sip of her dark tea. Her hands were perfectly steady today. "The Northern Baron's envoys are joining us for the morning meal. Lord Caldwell and Baron Richter. They are here to ratify the marriage treaty and formally recognize the alliance. They're here to smell the blood in the water," I corrected, finally scooping up a bite of the sludge. It tasted like unsalted oatmeal mixed with copper. I choked it down, relying on sheer willpower to keep my gag reflex in check. Calories were calories. They want to see if the human is actually a threat or just a dressed-up prisoner. "And what will they see, Cole?" She used my name for the first time. It felt strange in her mouth, clipped and cautious. "That depends," I said, tearing a piece of the iridescent meat. It was tough as shoe leather and tasted aggressively like smoke. "How far does your mother want me to go? Because if Richter tests me, I'm not going to challenge him to a gentleman's duel. I don't know your rules of engagement. I only know how to end things quickly." Rowena looked down at her cup, her white hair falling forward to shield her expression. "My husband, Thomas, played by the rules," I interrupted softly. "I know, and he was a brave man, but the rules got him killed." She didn't snap at me this time. She just traced the rim of her porcelain cup with a pale finger. "Richter hated Thomas. He thought Thomas was too noble for his own good, too predictable." "Predictable is a death sentence in my line of work," I said. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Tell me about Richter. He commands the largest mechanized battalion in the North. He is ruthless, deeply cynical, and he thrives on physical intimidation. He is a predator, Cole. He will look at you, see a creature half his mass, and he will try to break you." I smiled. I couldn't help it. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the grim, tired smirk of a man who had spent 10 years fighting planetary wars against things twice his size. "Good," I said, wiping my mouth with a linen napkin. "I like predators. They're so convinced they're at the top of the food chain, they never look down to see what's biting their ankles." Rowena stared at me, a complex knot of emotions twisting in her ruined eyes. It was a mix of disgust, morbid curiosity, and a tiny, desperate flicker of hope. "Get dressed, Cole," she whispered. "We have a kingdom to terrify." The dining hall was smaller than the great chamber where we had married, but it felt infinitely more suffocating. The walls were lined with dark, heavily varnished wood that seemed to absorb the light. At the center sat a long table carved from a single slab of petrified timber. Queen Vivian sat at the head, immaculate in a high-collared black tunic. To her right sat Baron Richter. Rowena wasn't exaggerating. The man was a mountain. He wore a heavy leather coat over polished iron plating, his shoulders so broad he took up the space of 2 chairs. His face was a map of old violence, thick, knotted scar tissue pulling at his jawline, and those sickly, jaundiced yellow eyes I had seen yesterday in the aisle. Beside him sat Lord Caldwell, a thinner, older man with cold, calculating eyes, who looked like he tracked every calorie anyone in the room consumed. Behind them stood 2 guards in heavy northern armor. Rowena and I were directed to the seats on the left side of the table, directly opposite the barons. "Ah," Richter rumbled as we sat down. His voice sounded like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a river. The grieving widow and her acquisition. Rowena's back was perfectly straight. "Baron Richter, Lord Caldwell, we trust your accommodations were sufficient." "They were entirely adequate, Princess," Caldwell said smoothly, though his eyes never left me. "Though I admit we were surprised by the suddenness of your nuptials. The ink on the casualty reports from Winter Pass is barely dry. The security of the realm does not wait for mourning periods, Caldwell," Queen Vivian stated from the head of the table. Her voice was ice. "The accords are signed. Earth is bound to House Kalen." Richter laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. He leaned forward, resting his massive armored forearms on the table. He looked at me. "Earth," he scoffed. "We hear the stories, the feral apes who crawled out of a radioactive mud ball. But looking at you, you're small. You have no natural armor, no claws. Your skin looks like it would tear if I sneezed on it." "It tears," I agreed mildly. I picked up a small silver knife from the table setting and began peeling a piece of local fruit that looked like a bruised plum. "But it heals. That's the trick with humans. We're very hard to permanently break," Richter sneered. He signaled to one of his guards behind him. The guard stepped forward, reaching into a satchel, and pulled out a heavy crystal decanter filled with a blood-red liquid. "A toast, then," Richter announced loudly, pouring a generous measure into his cup. "To the late great Commander Thomas, a true warrior who died standing on his own 2 feet. A man whose boots this little scavenger will never, ever fill." The room froze. Rowena stopped breathing beside me. I could feel the heat radiating off her, a sudden, violent spike of pure fury. Queen Vivian's eyes narrowed into slits, her jaw clenching. It was a blatant, calculated insult. If I got angry and yelled, I was an uncivilized brute throwing a tantrum. If I sat there and took it, I was weak, proving I couldn't defend my wife's honor. It was a neat little trap. I didn't yell. I didn't glare. I finished peeling the fruit. I set the silver knife down gently on the petrified wood. Click. Then I picked up my empty glass and held it out to Richter's guard, who was still holding the decanter. "Pour," I said. My voice was quiet, flat, dead. The guard hesitated, looking at Richter. The Baron gave a curt, arrogant nod. The guard stepped over and poured the red liquid into my glass. It smelled like fermented iron and rot. I stood up. I didn't rush. I moved with slow, deliberate intent, holding the glass up. I looked directly into Richter's yellow eyes. "You're right, Baron," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the room. "I'm not Thomas. I don't care about honor. I don't care about glorious last stands. I care about breathing. I raised the glass a fraction higher. Thomas died a hero. I didn't. To Thomas, I downed the liquid in one go. It burned like battery acid, searing the back of my throat, but I didn't flinch. I slammed the heavy crystal glass down onto the table, hard. The sound cracked through the room like a whip. Richter's arrogant smile faltered. The cold, sociopathic pragmatism of the toast unnerved him. It wasn't the reaction he wanted. The guard standing near me, the one who had poured the drink, shifted his weight. Maybe he felt the sudden shift in the room's dominance. Maybe he was just edgy. But his hand dropped toward the heavy kinetic pistol holstered at his hip. It was a tiny movement, a microaggression born of nerves. But for 10 years, my brain had been wired to react to that exact movement with overwhelming, preemptive violence. I didn't think, I just moved. Gravity here was heavier, but my muscles were built in a higher density environment. Compared to the lumbering Northern Guard, I was a coiled spring. Before the guard's fingers could even brush the grip of his pistol, I lunged across the corner of the table. I grabbed his thick wrist with my left hand, pulling him off balance, dragging his arm violently down onto the petrified wood table. With my right hand, I snatched the silver fruit knife I had just set down and drove it downward. I didn't stab his hand. I didn't want a murder charge on day one. I drove the blade directly into the heavy leather and iron webbing of his gauntlet, pinning his sleeve to the table with a sickening thud. The guard roared, trying to yank back, but I was already moving. I grabbed a handful of his thick breastplate collar and slammed his head downward, cracking his helmet against the table right next to the pinned knife. The impact shook the plates. I kept him pinned, my face inches from his visor. He was struggling, thrashing, but I had leverage. I have spent the last 3 weeks eating mold and sleeping in a puddle of my own sweat, I hissed, my voice vibrating with a raw, ugly rage that I didn't have to fake. The smell of his fear hit my nose, sour and sharp. My head is splitting. Every joint in my body is screaming, and I have absolutely nothing to lose. If you ever move your hand toward a weapon in my peripheral vision again, I won't use the fruit knife. I will cave your skull in with that porcelain teapot. Do we have an understanding? The guard gasped, stunned by the sheer, unchoreographed speed of the assault. He nodded frantically, his helmet scraping against the table. I let go of him. I pulled the silver knife out of the table, tossing it onto my plate, and sat back down in my chair. My chest was heaving. My bruised shoulder was screaming in agony. The silence in the room was absolute. It was thick enough to drown in. I picked up my spoon, scooped up another bite of the gray sulfur porridge, and forced myself to swallow it. I looked across the table at Baron Richter. His yellow eyes were wide, the arrogant sneer completely wiped from his scarred face. Lord Caldwell looked like he was going to be sick. "You were saying, Baron?" I asked quietly, not breaking eye contact. "Something about claws?" Richter didn't answer. He stared at me, calculating, recalculating, and realizing that the math had fundamentally changed. I glanced to my right. Rowena was staring at me. Her hands were gripped tight in her lap. Her eyes were wide, taking in the bruised, exhausted, vicious creature sitting next to her. She looked horrified. But beneath the horror, I saw something else. Vindication. Nobody breathed for a solid 10 seconds. The only sound in the dining hall was the frantic, raspy panting of the guard pinned against the table, his eyes wide behind the visor. Baron Richter slowly pushed his chair back. The heavy wood screeched against the stone floor. He didn't look at his humiliated guard. He looked at me, his jaundiced eyes narrowing into tight, venomous slits. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just turned his massive frame, the iron plating of his coat clanking dully, and marched toward the heavy double doors. Lord Caldwell was half a second behind him, his face completely devoid of color. He looked like a man who had walked into a cage expecting a declawed house cat, only to find a starving wolf. The doors slammed shut. I didn't move. I kept my posture rigid, my breathing deliberately slow, until the echoing thud of the doors faded into the stone walls. "Sloppy," Queen Vivian said. I looked at her. She was casually wiping the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. Her icy blue eyes betrayed absolutely nothing. "But effective," she amended, dropping the napkin onto her plate. "Richter respects violence. You gave him a language he understands. He will return to the north and tell his generals that the human is unstable and highly dangerous. It buys us 6 months, maybe a year." She stood up. The 2 remaining guards in the room stiffened. "Dismissed, Mr. Cole. Try not to bleed on the tapestries on your way back." She glided out of the room through a side door, leaving Rowena and me alone with the ruined breakfast and the lingering smell of spilled iron-rich liquor. "Come on," I muttered, pushing myself up from the chair. My voice cracked. The adrenaline was evaporating, and the crash was catastrophic. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, slick and uncomfortable. The throbbing in my left shoulder escalated from a dull ache to a sharp, stabbing agony that radiated down to my fingertips. My knees felt like they were packed with ground glass, courtesy of the heavier gravity. Rowena didn't say a word. She stood, her white morning coat rustling, and walked beside me. We navigated the corridors in silence. The castle felt different now. Word was already spreading. The servants we passed didn't just avert their eyes. They pressed themselves flat against the walls, their chins tucked to their chests. The guards gripped their rifles a little tighter, their postures rigid with a new, terrified respect. I hated it. I hated the fear smelling sour in the air. But I kept my back straight and my steps even. The limp was strictly forbidden. Not here. Not where the walls had eyes. When we finally reached our quarters, I waited for Rowena to step inside before I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind us. I didn't bother wedging the shelf under the handle this time. I just let go. The facade dropped instantly. My legs simply stopped holding my weight. I staggered forward, catching myself on the heavy oak dining table. I hissed through my teeth, gripping the edge of the wood so hard my knuckles turned white. My chest heaved, pulling in desperate lungfuls of the dusty, lavender-scented air. "Cole?" Rowena's voice was sharp, laced with sudden alarm. I heard her footsteps quickly crossing the stone floor. "Don't call a medic," I gasped, keeping my head down. My vision was swimming, the edges fringed with dark static. "No medics. We don't show weakness. Not today." "You're shaking," she said. She was standing right next to me. I could smell the ozone in her heavy silk clothes. "Just the gravity," I forced out, "and the dungeon, and the fact that I just drank something that tasted like battery acid." A wave of nausea hit me. I gagged, my stomach twisting violently against the sulfurous porridge I had forced down earlier. I clamped my mouth shut, swallowing hard, fighting the urge to empty my stomach onto the expensive rug. I felt a hand on my back, It was hesitant, light, but the cold touch of her fingers through the thin linen of my shirt was a shock to my system. "Sit down," she ordered. It wasn't the voice of a grieving widow. It was the voice of a commander's wife. She grabbed my uninjured right arm, pulling me away from the table and guiding me toward the stiff leather armchair near the hearth. I collapsed into it, my head falling back against the cushion. I closed my eyes, focusing entirely on the rhythmic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. I heard the sound of rushing water. A moment later, a cold, damp cloth was pressed against my forehead. The relief was immediate. I opened my eyes. Rowena was kneeling beside the chair. The severe, untouchable princess of House Kalin was kneeling on the cold stone floor, wiping the sour sweat from a mercenary's face. Her white hair had slipped from its pins, falling over her shoulders in a messy, chaotic curtain. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. Her ruined, red-rimmed eyes were searching my face, not looking for a predator, but looking for the man beneath the bruises. "You could have just sat there. You could have ignored the insult." "No, I couldn't," I rasped, my throat raw. "Richter was testing the fence. If I let him push me, he knows the fence is weak. He comes back tomorrow and pushes harder. If I bite his hand off the first time he reaches through the wire, he thinks twice before trying again." She dipped the cloth into a small bronze basin she had brought over, wringing it out. "You terrified them. You terrified my mother's guards." "Good. You terrified me." She stopped moving. She left her hands resting on the edge of the basin, her gaze dropping to the floor. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. I looked at her. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the sharp lines of exhaustion framing her mouth. She was trapped in this nightmare just as deeply as I was, surrounded by people who wanted to use her grief as a stepping stone to power. "I'm not going to hurt you, Rowena," I said. My voice was a low, rough whisper. "I'm a lot of ugly things. I'm violent, I'm cynical, and I'm deeply paranoid. But I don't turn on my own squad." She looked up at me, her brow furrowing. "Squad?" "We're in the trenches together," I said, offering a weak, lopsided smile. "Your mother threw us both to the wolves. As far as I'm concerned, that makes us a team. I cover your blind spots, you cover mine." She stared at me for a long time. The tension in her shoulders slowly, incrementally began to unwind. "You are a very strange creature, Cole," she whispered. "Yeah, well," I muttered, closing my eyes again. "Earth is a strange place." By nightfall, the castle had settled into an uneasy quiet. The northern barons had departed before the sun hit its peak, their transport ships burning hard into the upper atmosphere, leaving streaks of black exhaust against the bruised purple sky. I was sitting on the floor near the hearth, my back against the warm stone of the fireplace. The phantom pain in my shoulder had subsided to a dull, manageable burn. I had a heavy crystal glass of the local peat smoke liquor resting on my knee. Rowena was sitting in the leather armchair. She had finally taken off the heavy morning coat, changing into a simple, dark gray tunic. She looked smaller without the armor of her royal attire. More human. "Thomas thought Earth was a myth," she said, quietly, staring into the low flames. It was the first time she had brought him up without the razor edge of defensiveness. I took a slow sip of the liquor. It still burned, but I was getting used to it. "A lot of people do. We try to keep to ourselves mostly. The galaxy is a crowded neighborhood. We prefer our own backyard. He thought humans were just stories meant to frighten recruits, she continued, her voice soft, distant. He said no species could survive the environment you describe. The gravity, the atmospheric pressure, the wars. We're stubborn, I said simply. We don't know when to quit. She turned her head, looking at me. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows across her face. Is that why you chose this? Why you chose to marry me instead of dying in the mines? Stubbornness? I swirled the amber liquid in my glass. I thought about the cell, the smell of oxidized copper, the total crushing darkness. I thought about Vivian's cold, pragmatic ultimatum. I chose this because I want to live, I said honestly. It's not noble. It's not a grand sacrifice. I don't want to drown in my own blood in a dark hole. I want to see the sun come up tomorrow, even if it's a bruised purple sun I don't recognize. I looked up, meeting her eyes. You're grieving. You loved him, and he's gone. I'm not going to try to replace him. I'm not going to ask you to pretend this is a real marriage. But I am going to ask you to survive this with me. Rowena didn't look away. For the first time since I had walked into her dark, candle-lit room, the radioactive grief in her eyes seemed to recede, replaced by something harder, something like resolve. My mother will expect an heir, she said. The words were flat, stripped of any romantic pretense. It was pure, ugly politics. Your mother can expect whatever she wants, I replied, my voice hardening. She bought a guard dog, not a breeding stallion. If the barons stay in line, she won't push it. She needs the threat of my presence more than she needs a half-human baby complicating the bloodline. Rowena let out a short, breathy sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. You really have no respect for royalty, do you? I respect competence, I corrected. I respect people who keep their word. Titles are just fancy name tags. She leaned back in the chair, pulling her knees up slightly. The North won't stay quiet forever. Richter will test you again. Next time, it won't be a guard reaching for a pistol at a breakfast table. It will be an assassin in the dark, or a mechanized strike on the border. Let them come, I said. I finished the liquor, setting the empty glass down on the stone floor with a dull clink. I've fought mechanized infantry before. They bleed oil, but they still break if you hit them in the right spot. I looked around the massive, shadowy room. The heavy velvet curtains, the thick oak doors, the cold stone. It was a prison, a beautiful, luxurious prison, but a cage nonetheless. We're going to have to play the part, I said, turning my attention back to her. In public, we have to look united. If they see a crack between us, they'll drive a wedge into it. Rowena nodded slowly. United. Yeah, I said. I picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth and absent-mindedly stirred the dying embers. A shower of bright orange sparks danced up into the black chimney. We hold the line, together. She watched the sparks fade into the darkness. Thomas held the line. It broke him. Thomas stood still, I said, setting the poker down. I looked at her, my expression dead serious. I don't stand still, Rowena. If they push us, we don't just hold the line. We move it. Silence settled over the room again. But it wasn't the suffocating, tense silence of the night before. It was quieter, truer. Rowena stood up. She walked over to the cedar chest at the foot of the massive bed, opened it, and pulled out 2 thick woolen blankets. She walked back toward the hearth and dropped one on the floor next to me. She didn't go back to the bed. Instead, she wrapped the other blanket around her shoulders and sat down on the rug, a few feet away from me, facing the fire. "The floor is less drafty," she said softly. I looked at the blanket she had tossed me, then looked at her. She was staring into the flames, her white hair glowing orange in the firelight. "Yeah," I said, pulling the heavy wool over my aching legs. "It keeps you honest." We sat there in the dark, two captives in a gilded cage, listening to the castle breathe. The war wasn't over. It hadn't even started yet. But as I leaned my head back against the cold stone, I realized something. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. That brings us to the end of Cole and Rowena's forced alliance, a brutal start to a complex survival story in a galaxy that shows no mercy. Did Cole make the right call at the breakfast table, or did he just paint a bigger target on his back? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this grounded, gritty take